Politics, power, and reproductive health. For many people, the issue gets personal.
We don't think about politics around regulating medical practice otherwise, right, in most other situations, unless it somehow intersects with sex and reproduction and women.
Reproductive rights have divided people for centuries, but they reached a new political height after the Supreme Court voted to strike down the landmark Roe v. Wade decision, providing national access to abortion.
End all, be all, abortion is health care, and your body should not be regulated by the government.
We're ready to meet, and we are ready to create some of the toughest laws that there are.
But the fight over reproductive rights started long before the abortion debate.
It's not just a story about religion, it's a story about politics and how these two things intersect together to, create a situation that doesn't necessarily have to be this way.
Kevin Walston, the co-author of The Politics of the Pill, tells us back in the late 1800s, abortion wasn't connected with religion, morality, or other themes we see today.
There was actually quite little regulation of contraception or abortion. In the abortion realm, you had this idea that women would be able to sort of determine for themselves when abortions would be appropriate.
Walston added it was actually the medical industry that fought to limit access to contraception and abortions as a way of monopolizing control over reproductive services.
We have this emerging profession, right, of doctors, medical expertise, and they see themselves as being in competition with more traditional healers, with more traditional approaches to midwifery and so forth.
There were also concerns over immigration, as a swell of Southern, Central, and Eastern European migrants who were mostly Catholic or Jewish arrived in the U.S. Political science professor Josh Wilson says natural-born Americans, who were often white Protestants, saw these immigrants as a threat.
The idea here is these new immigrants are reproducing at high rates for X, Y, and Z reasons, right? But they're reproducing at higher rates, and so they're going to overwhelm us with their numbers.
These nativists were invested in denying white Protestant women access to contraception and abortion to keep their birth rates high. Enter Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. She started the nation's first birth control clinic in 1916 and helped legalize providing women with information about contraceptives and sexually transmitted diseases.
It was good news to us all that the Federal Council of Churches came out openly on the subject of birth control.
By the 1930s, a Gallup poll showed over 60% of Americans favored the birth control movement. By 1959, 73% felt information about birth control should be freely available. But it was strictly regulated until 1965, when the Supreme Court declared bans on birth control unconstitutional. Even then, only married couples could purchase contraceptives until 1972. Janet Morana, the executive director of Priests for Life, says Catholics were among the early members of the anti-abortion movement in the late 60s. The church began challenging contraception, warning it contradicted the Bible's teachings.
We say life is sacred from the moment of conception till natural death. So that's the teachings of our religion. So it was very natural for the Catholic Church to kind of take a step forward and being there in the very early days.
Despite the Catholic Church's vocal opposition to birth control, a Harris poll from 1968 showed only 15% of American Catholics were against contraception, and a majority rejected the idea that birth control was immoral or inappropriate. At the same time, doctors were facing a public health crisis as more women received illegal abortions. While abortion-related deaths were dropping, the Guttmacher Institute says illegal abortions still accounted for 17% of all pregnancy deaths in 1965, and many deaths may have gone unreported. In the years just before Roe, doctors like Bernard Nathanson lobbied for states to loosen their abortion laws as a way to cut down risk and improve safety.
He then, with these other guys, said, we have to let women have abortion if they want to have an abortion. So they set out to make abortion legal in New York State, which they accomplished in 1970.
At the same time, Republicans were also fighting to liberalize abortion regulations. A 1972 Gallup poll found 68% of Republicans believed the decision to get an abortion should be made between a woman and her doctor, compared to 59% of Democrats. But the party's stances shifted after the Supreme Court handed down its decision on Roe v. Wade in 1973.
Abortion rights activists have somewhat of a mobilization problem because they've won in court, right? So the idea being here that it's much easier to mobilize people to fight against something, right? There's something for anti-abortion activists to try to achieve.
Wilson says this was the perfect moment for Republicans to expand their electoral base. According to Wilson, at the time, evangelical Christians were furious with a decade of federal government desegregating schools. Religious institutions responded by creating their own private schools for white children. But in the 70s, the government stepped in to break them apart. Republicans were quick to respond to the evangelicals' anger with the government and worked with Pastor Jerry Falwell to help bring evangelicals into the Republican Party. They used new ultrasound technology in movies like The Silent Scream, which was narrated by Nathanson, who changed his stance on abortion after it was legalized. Wilson says this was a strategy to convince people that abortion was an urgent issue of all matters moral.
They had to be introduced to the idea. They had to be taught to invest in it. The argument there was essentially about American moral collapse and saying that, we need to put America back into this kind of idealized religious conception that they had of the past. And abortion became a way of talking about a lot of changes that had happened in the previous decades.
But Marana tells us while Falwell and Republicans may have played a role in romancing evangelicals, they saw the abortion fight as a way to help women and bring people into the church.
The main focus for them was bringing people to Jesus. They saw pregnant women who needed help as a mission field. Like, we can bring the gospel to these women by also helping them not to have an abortion.
Power and tradition may have also mobilized voters. In the late 60s and early 70s, more women were embracing feminism and sexual liberation and skirting traditional gender roles. Conservatives and religious leaders like Billy Graham argued for the need to restore the country to the way it once was by regulating sexuality.
They're expressing themselves and saying, we want sex freedom. You see, God has built in your body certain restrictions. And if you break the law, you hurt yourself.
Walston says messages like these, in part, convinced evangelicals to crowd the polls. Their turnout helped elect Republican President Ronald Reagan.
The Republican Party, I think, was first to realize the potential electoral benefits that could be accrued to them by becoming the party standing in opposition to abortion rights.
Reagan was staunchly anti-abortion, and throughout the 80s, Democrats began to nominate pro-abortion rights candidates to fight against him. Walston and Marana agree that's when the politicization of reproductive health became clear.
This, of course, set into effect a series of dynamics that resulted in the Republican Party becoming the party of the highly religious and therefore those highly opposed to abortion. The Democratic Party became the party of pro-choice.
I don't think there was a deliberate shift of like, the Democrats are going this way, Republicans are going that way. It's just different philosophies as people came into power.
Wilson argues abortion regulation became a key political issue as the courts took up bigger cases and created more room to chip away at reproductive rights. Like in 2016, when the Supreme Court ruled Texas could not place restrictions on abortion services because it would create an undue burden on people's constitutional rights. The ideological makeup of the bench also brought the politicization of abortion to the forefront, after former President Trump appointed 3 conservative justices during his 4 years in office.
He was like an open book. If you elect me, here's the list I'll pick from. If I get the opportunity to put a certain court justice on the court, here's what I'll do. And yes, I will be a pro-life president.
But now with the constitutional right to have an abortion overturned, Walston says other aspects of reproductive health could be restricted next.
If it's something that prevents implantation of a fertilized egg, that would classify it as abortifacient, and the right to have access to that, whatever it is, be it an IUD, be it hormonal birth control, doesn't even matter what it is, would then no longer be constitutionally protected and could be, in theory, taken away by a state government.
When asked why politicians are so invested in reproductive rights, Walston had this to say.
This is about a difference of who should be emphasized here, about who should matter more. Should it be the person that we actually have, the American citizen, or should it be the potential life, the fetus, the one that, through this point of view, requires more protection because they are in this vulnerable and fairly unique position.
But Marana says overturning Roe v. Wade is a way to give the will back to the people.
It's taking the abortion decision out of the judicial branch of government and putting it back where it belongs, in the legislative branch so that you elect the people in your area to pass the kind of laws you want to see passed where you live.
There may also be another motivating factor for both Democrats and Republicans to politicize reproductive rights.
Both sides of the aisle, so to speak, want to pass laws in their interest.
There are now powerful incentives for their politicization.
And with Roe v. Wade now overturned, legislators will need to determine how far they want to go to constrict or liberalize women's reproductive rights. Marisa Giorgio, Newsy.